Hello everyone, I'm KM Weiland. I run the writing website helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com, and welcome to today's writing video. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that is something that all writers generally at some point or another have questions about, and that is POV. POV stands for point of view, and it is the perspective through which you tell your story's narrative. So specifically today, we're going to be talking about which person that you might want to use when choosing your POV. And by that, what's meant is either you're going to choose to tell the story through first person, second person, third person, or omniscient. Now, obviously, there are many other questions that come up around POV. There's questions of which characters should you choose to filter, the story through their POV. But that's a whole other topic. So I will leave links to some resources down below, including some great books by other authors that cover these topics in more depth. But today we're just going to be going over kind of what's the differences in the pros and cons, the advantages and the disadvantages of these different approaches to POV. So I'll just go over each one quickly and we can just talk about some of the reasons you might choose them and some of the reasons you might not, depending on the type of story you're writing. And at the end, we're also going to talk just a little bit about head hopping. So the first one I want to talk about, just because it's the easiest one to move over quickly, is second person. So second person is when you would be telling a story using the pronouns you. So basically, it's as if you're saying that the story is from the perspective of the reader, right? So it's you are opening the door, you are doing this thing, you are fighting in the battle, whatever the case may be. Now, obviously, this is quite unusual. You see this very rarely within books, and it's almost always gimmicky. There's a couple novels that are relatively well known for having used it. Bright Light's Big City is one of them, by J. McInerney, I think. And also Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night. So if you're interested, and it is just kind of interesting, it's an interesting approach. It's kind of like the choose your own adventure stories that you may have written as a kid. It's highly stylistic and therefore can be quite gimmicky, and therefore is used very rarely and really isn't recommended for most fiction at all, particularly mainstream fiction. But it's just good to be aware of it because it is in there. That leaves what are really the two main and most popular POVs that you can use, at least at this time. This is the two that are seen most often and used most often. And that is first person, in which you'd be using the pronouns I. So you're telling the story from the protagonist's point of view or the character's point of view, and saying things like, I went through the door, I, bought groceries, something like that. Versus third person, in which you're using pronouns like he or she or they to tell what's going on. So he knocked on the door, she opened the door, things like that. You'd be telling it through that perspective. Now, first person and third person, for all intents and purposes, are actually quite similar to execute, and in the advantages or disadvantages that you might gain from them. The way you write the story in a deep third person POV is very similar to how you'd write it in a first person POV, the only difference being the pronouns. And in these POVs, what you're really trying to achieve is the effect that the entire story is more or less being told through the thoughts and the voice of whoever the narrating character may be. So again, it's very stylistic in the sense that the voice you're trying to create on the page is the character's voice, right? It's the same voice that they would use when speaking dialogue, only you're in their head. You can, as in any story, tell their thoughts through direct thoughts, which are told in present tense and usually italicized or something like that. But in these deep POVs, everything that's coming across is really in the character's point of view. First person is always deep. It's always right there inside the character's head, inside their mind. Every word is intended to be seen as the character's point of view. And because of this, it does make it the most intimate of all of the POVs, because it puts the reader right there in the character's head. And sometimes that's exactly what you want. That level of intimacy between reader and characters rarely a bad thing, right? You want them to identify with the character and, understand what they're thinking and so forth and so on. This particular approach is very popular right now in romance. Alternating first persons between the two love interests is what you'll see in most romance stories these days. So just because you're writing in first person doesn't mean the whole story has to be told from the same POV. You just have to make it very clear when you switch, which is usually done chapter by chapter, and there's a heading at the beginning of the chapter indicating which character's POV you're in. The more technical side of this, or the more advanced side of the technique, is that ideally you want readers to be able to tell which POV they're in just because the voices are distinct. And that can get tricky because ultimately it's all your voice, right? But the more personalized each of the voices are in a first-person narrative like that to the different characters, then the more characterized those people become. They come off the page, as dimensional and separate people rather than, as just kind of facets of the same person with the same voice and the same personality and so forth and so on. Now, some of the downsides of first person are basically too much intimacy. There are stories and characters where maybe you don't want characters to be that, or you don't want readers to be that close to a character. And this could be for a number of reasons. It could be, sometimes, not always, but because the character is kind of unsavory and people don't want to be in their head, to that degree. That's not always true, because obviously there are stories, that are about horrible people and we're in their POV, and that can be a very fascinating way to explore, a dark psyche kind of within a story. But sometimes I think really the more complicated characters for first person are characters who are kind of in between, right? They're not entirely lovable, but they're also not, fascinatingly evil either. And their foibles are more things like, they're prideful, or they're, self-obsessed, or they're insecure. If that's not handled just right, that can become very grating within a first person POV, because it's just constantly there in the reader's face that all the bad things that the character may be thinking either about themselves or others. And sometimes that's fine, sometimes that's part of what they're working through in the story. But it's just something to be aware of, that sometimes a first person can actually have the unintended effect of distancing readers from the character because they don't like the character as much. The character would be more likable if there was a little more distant. They'd be more sympathetic. Now, another aspect of this is that sometimes you don't want readers to know what's happening in the character's head. Like maybe the character knows something and you don't want the reader to know it. And there are definitely ways to get around this when you're writing a deep POV. And generally speaking, you do want readers to pretty much know what your character knows so that they can advance through the story with them, right? So they can identify with them as the story progresses. But there are definitely stories where you don't want readers to know. And in those instances, first person might not be your best choice. And one other thing I will say about first person is that generally speaking, if you don't have a really good voice for the character, if it's just kind of flat or monotone, then first person is probably not your best choice. This is not always true, but generally speaking, this can kind of just flatline your entire narrative in a way that wouldn't necessarily happen in a different kind of POV, just because it isn't lively, it isn't as interesting, and because of kind of the staccato nature that can sometimes happen when you're writing prose in a first person narrative, it just kind of exacerbates the flatness. So basically, if you're going to write a first person, and this is true regardless, but particularly if you're going to be writing a first person POV, you want to really try to find a character or create a voice for a character that's really interesting, that is lively and has personality and, isn't just a monotone recording of what they see and what they do and what their, how their thoughts are reacting. Now, third person, as I say, can be quite similar to first person, and that is if you're doing a deep POV. So one of the advantages of third person is it's quite flexible. You can do a lot with third person. And again, third person is where you are telling a story about someone else, right? So you're using third person pronouns like he or she. And that's how you're addressing the POV character. Now, in a deep POV, if you're going deep with a third person POV, then you're essentially still deep in their head and just reporting, what they're experiencing and what they're thinking and feeling in pretty much the same way as with a first person narrative. Again, you can do direct thoughts that are italicized, but you don't have to, because the whole narrative is still in their voice. It's still, coming through the character, basically. You've just chosen to take that one little step back and use third-person pronouns instead of first-person pronouns. However, there's a whole range, a whole gamut of depth and shallowness that you can play with within third-person POV. So you may choose to go really deep and be completely inside a character's head, or you may choose to draw back to varying degrees and not be so deep in their head. So you'd still be using the third-person pronouns and reporting what they're doing, but you're not so deep in their head. And you can still tell what they're thinking. You share that with readers, but it becomes more that you are reporting their thoughts rather than that you're recording them through their voice. There's varying ranges of depth that you can go with that. And in most stories, you'll zoom in a little bit here and zoom out a little bit there. You want consistency, but you can think of it kind of in a similar way to what you would see in a movie where, sometimes there's close-ups and then sometimes it's a wide shot. But what's important is that the voice remains consistent, that readers always have a sense of who's talking to them, even if they're not, consciously thinking about what that may be. They have a sense of, they know, and it's never like a surprise of just like feeling jarred because where'd that come from? That doesn't feel like it fits with the narrative voice that's been used up until this point. And again, with third person, you can totally do multiple POVs. You can, go deep within the perspective of any number of characters and show what they're seeing in different scenes. One thing to think about with POVs of any type, if you're going to do multiple POVs, is to really consider why you're putting it in there. Right? Because POVs create your narrative. Basically, they frame every piece of your narrative. Usually putting in, just random POVs or, a POV from a character who's going to have a POV scene just once, just so you can show something that's happening that the protagonist isn't on stage for. It can be effective, and it can definitely help you, show information that the reader wouldn't be able to access through the protagonist's point of view. But you have to be careful with this because it can easily scatter your narrative. Generally speaking, the fewer POVs you can get away with, the better. One POV is really, in my opinion, very underestimated. These days, we tend to, want huge, sprawling POV stories, but a single POV story done well, they're great. Again, in romance, you're generally going to have 2. And in other types of story, it's fine to have dozens. But what's important is that you're aware of how these POVs are interacting with the story's overall structure. We talked a few months ago in the video about multiple timelines and plot lines about how it can be really effective to bring minor characters in at the structural moments as kind of a subplot, and just sewing them in at regular intervals so they don't just show up once and it's just sort of like, well, that was random, right? It feels like it was on purpose and that there's a thematic reason and a structural reason for why these POVs are in here rather than them just being convenient for the author. So that's always something to think about when you're choosing how many or which characters are going to get POVs within a story. So with third person, you can, zoom all the way out. And when you get all the way out, that is generally what's called omniscient POV. So omniscient POV is where you're not really in any one specific character's head. As the name suggests, the story is being told from an all-knowing point of view. That point of view generally being the author, although it can on occasion be a specific narrator within the story who knows everything that's happening and they're just kind of reporting it back. And the advantage of omniscient, obviously, is that you can, go anywhere, tell anything. It isn't as confined. It doesn't have to play by as many rules in a certain sense as the more limited POVs of, first person and deep third. The disadvantage is that it isn't as intimate. It's by nature more distant, right? And so even though you can dip into a character's head here, or report on what they may be thinking there, you aren't there. You aren't in their head. You aren't just following, a character through the entire story and experiencing it from the inside out. So the deep POVs, first person and deep third, it's an inside out experience of the story. Omniscient is an outside in, right? You're looking at the story from an outside perspective and sometimes delving in to their heads or their thoughts. And usually it's more of when you are delving into their thoughts, it's more that you're reporting what they're thinking, rather than, trying to create an experience where readers are equally experiencing it. And Omniscient was very popular back in the day, right? So like Victorian novels, that kind of thing, were almost all told from an omniscient point of view. And it's kind of, as I say, grown more out of favor to where mainstream fiction is more in a deep POV these days. But it's still used, and it can be very effective, at creating kind of more of a stylistic tone for a story, particularly if like you are trying to give it a historical flavor. Omniscient can be very effective at doing that. The Aubrey Maturin series by Patrick O'Brien, he does this masterfully. Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell comes to mind also as a story that does this really well. And there are many, many others. But the major downfall of Omniscient is that it can be done very poorly, as with any of the POVs. But when Omniscient is done poorly, it's because it kind of lacks that focus, right? It feels like an author who doesn't have control of their narrative. Like they're just using Omniscient because they just, want to tell everything, versus it being a cohesive choice, right? Because a good Omniscient story is still limited. It's still choosing to focus on very specific things for very specific reasons. It's not just jumping from this character to that character to that character because it's convenient to tell a bigger story. And I would dare say this is something I'm just thinking about right now, so I'd want to think about it more before really camping on it. But I feel like the random Omniscient narratives that don't really work are doing that because they're more plot-based, right? They're just using the characters and jumping from character to character to character as a way to just tell what's happening. It's about what's out there and what the characters are seeing, rather than the characters and what they're doing. Whereas a more controlled and contained Omniscient narrative is one that is, still focused on the characters. It has a very good grasp of how to integrate character, plot, and theme, and is using its POV choices to accomplish that. So part and parcel of Omniscient narratives that don't work and that are just kind of jumping around all over the place is a POV mistake or pitfall that you will often hear called head hopping. And head hopping can happen in any of the different POV types that we've talked about. And basically what it is that you're breaking the rules that you have set for your story and your POV use within your story. And you're jumping from the established POV into a different character's head. This is most obvious if you are writing a deep third person or first person, although that's less likely to be seen there. But if you're writing a deep third person, where you're in one character's head and that's the whole scene is being told, and then all of a sudden there's a thought or an observation from another character, right, who's maybe watching your protagonist. Maybe you're doing it because you want, an outside perspective on your protagonist. You want somebody to describe how they look, or, offer a perspective on what they're doing or why they're doing it. And so you jump real quick over into this other person's head and give their thoughts and their perspective. And then you jump back to the original character. That's head hopping. And that can be very jarring and confusing for readers. And at the very least, it does not contribute to a cohesive narrative. The simplest way to avoid this is to just recognize that you can use other characters' POVs, but you need to do so in a structured way where you end one character's POV with a scene or a chapter break and then switch to the next character's. And generally, because this is indicated by scene breaks, it's something that if you're going to jump to a different character's POV, that character's POV needs to, constitute a scene, or at least a big chunk of the scene to be worth it. Jumping to another character's POV for a paragraph or something generally isn't a good idea. It can be kind of quirky and funny if that's the kind of story that you're writing, but otherwise it's basically head hopping, just, sort of disguised. So the best way to deal if you want to include multiple characters' POVs is to create a scene that's from one character's POV and then switch to the next character's POV and remain consistent with each character within their section, right? Now this becomes a little more complicated when you're writing an omniscient POV that by nature is able to look into any character's head, right? And the rules do blur a little here. And it's a little harder to be able to say, well, that's omniscient and that's head hopping. And, probably the basic bottom line is, does it work? Does it feel jarring? Does it feel like you're just jumping from character to character to character? Or does it feel seamless? And studying, how authors have done this in omniscient narratives and made it work can be very helpful in recognizing the difference between head hopping and omniscient. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, but a general way to kind of test whether you are head hopping versus using an omniscient POV is, are you going deep into the characters' heads when you shift, right? Like, are you explicitly saying this character is thinking this, and then this character is thinking this, like using direct thoughts, where they are, where maybe the one character is thinking, I really want ice cream for breakfast. And then you go over and then Sally's thinking, I really want eggs for breakfast. Where you are going deep, right? You're trying to switch into a deep POV for multiple characters. And again, you will see exceptions to this, but often that's going to be a pretty jarring approach to readers versus maintaining a distant POV. Again, thinking of it as if you are telling the story through a specific narrator's perspective. So it's still a unified, cohesive perspective, whether that perspective is, you sort of as a narrator and therefore a character within the story, or a specific narrator, like for instance, in Marcus Zuzak's The Book Thief, right? We have Death narrating the entire story. So obviously Zuzak is ultimately the narrator. He's the one writing this, but he uses Death as a character within the story who has an omniscient POV and can examine everything that's happening and give kind of a big picture view of what's going on within the story. So POV is arguably one of the most tricky techniques within narrative fiction. And there's a lot to kind of get your head around and learn. And I think the best way to learn it really is studying how it's done. Because it's one thing to read it, because, if you're not paying attention, a good POV is very seamless, right? You're not thinking about it. You're not thinking, oh, that's first person. I mean, I've read books where I had to go back and look, like, was that first person or omniscient or what was it? Because it was so seamless that I didn't think about it. And that's the effect you want to have on readers. But as you're trying to figure out how to write it, you need to go back and really study, like, what is the writer doing to create this cohesion and this seamless effect, whether they're writing first person or third or omniscient. And as always, paying attention, to how you respond and react to these various POVs so you can understand which effect you want to convey within your own story. All right, so that's just a few little thoughts on a very big topic. More resources down below. And I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to keep up with the rest of the content that I produce, including the weekly post and podcast that I put out, you can do that by signing up at my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. And I hope you'll also come and hang out on Instagram at author KM Weiland, where I post quotes and reels and epiphanies and insights that I don't really post anywhere else. So I will see you again next time. And until then, happy writing.